Thank you, Richard, and thank you very much to the committee for inviting me along this evening, and Judy in particular. I'm not a native of Altrincham or Bowdon, but actually that's where I live. So I've got the double pleasure of speaking as somebody that's had the privilege of being involved in some of the studies and some of the work in Altrincham, and also living in Altrincham and in Bowdon. So it is a double pleasure and a genuine pleasure to get to talk to you this evening. I have brought some slides. There's quite a few. I will try and get through them quite quickly at a steady pace, but please feel free to interrupt me with any questions. I'm keen to have a conversation rather than just download loads of information. But Angela, thank you very much for sharing the slides on screen. It's possible maybe to make them full screen. If you don't mind me, Angela, asking you to roll on to each next slide. Mm-hmm. I might just start by just saying who I am a little bit more in my professional context, because I'm the founder of the practice, one of the two founders of the practice Civic engineers, who are consulting engineers with offices across Manchester, London, Glasgow, and Leeds. This is an away day that we had before COVID, when people could get together without the social distancing problems. This was in North Yorkshire, where we all went camping last year. Just to attempt to try and continue to cultivate our culture. Culture being, technical expertise, obviously as engineers, but actually bringing a slightly more emotionally intelligent approach to what that means in terms of our urban settlements, and hopefully that comes through in the slides that I'm about to share with you. I think on the next slide, these few images here are actually not that long ago. The top two are a pair from Stamford New Road. You'll recognise the clock tower, I'm sure, in front of the transport interchange, and the ones below are slightly earlier, perhaps just at the turn of the century. And I think it is interesting, even in that period, in that sort of 40, 50-year period, just how more intensely used the streets are. Stamford New Road, the bottom pair are Railway Street, looking up towards Ashley Road, up towards Bowdon and Ashley. Quite charming with the awnings and the sort of carts, and interestingly again with the streetcars, but a kind of lack of tension in the streets. On this next image here, signaled a sort of serious change in our approach, our society's approach to urban infrastructure. Post-war, there was a key fork in the road, quite literally, for the government to make a decision as to what they were going to do and what they were going to invest in strategically in terms of highway infrastructure and infrastructure more generally. The chap in the top right-hand corner is the Right Honourable Ernest Marples, who was the Minister for Transport in the late 50s and early 60s. And he commissioned two key reports: the Beeching report, which is, Beeching is the chap just below him on the right-hand side there. He was responsible for trying to bring the rail service back into some sort of level of profitability. But in doing so, he did significantly reduce the network. And you can see how the impact that his report had in terms of the range of the railway network in those two images in the middle between 1963 and 1984. There was about 5,000 miles reduced with a significant number of stations. But the other key point is this commissioning of the report, the Buchanan report, Traffic in Towns, and the image below with the green car there. Sorry, Angela, sorry. The image in the middle of that slide, just showing the principle of segregation. So there was an acceptance that cars were going to come into town and city centres, but the solution in Traffic in Towns was to segregate them, to allow for cars to continue to come in, but put pedestrians on the margins and try and save them and protect them. And it's quite interesting on this next slide, Angela, the impact that a lot of these measures had. There was already a decline in cycling. Interesting, at the left-hand scale of all these numbers is in 1949, there was up about 14 billion miles per year were being cycled. So that was the number of bikes that were in use. And you can see there was a dramatic fall in the amount of miles per bike through to the 70s. The blue line is 1960. That's the point at which Ernest Marples introduced the Buchanan and Beeching reports, and that was the strategic shift, the sort of really making the major changes in how our society moved after that. And on this next slide, this is the pattern of development that started to spring from those decisions. You can see in the top half of this image here, there's a sort of a segregation of different types of use, with business parks and sort of exclusively retail areas and big box development and out of town shopping centres. It's also on this next slide, Angela, I think it's quite interesting just to remind ourselves of the sort of the culture that started to emerge around that time as well. That this image here, "One false move and you're dead," was a public safety campaign that ran through the 80s. And these images on the right hand side also comically sort of representing the jeopardy and danger and allocation of space that sprung from some of those strategic decisions that Ernest Marples instigated back in the 1960s. On this next slide, this graph here starts to show the types of impact that some of those decisions have had on our public health. So in these yellow boxes here, it indicates the impact of sedentary lifestyles. And what I mean by that is, driving and not having activity as an integral part of our everyday, issues around obesity and high blood pressure and diabetes and cholesterol and kidney problems. So taking the activity, our movement out of our everyday through these strategic choices started to have a negative impact on public health. And on this next slide, I've included this just to sort of remind us that it wasn't that long ago, in many respects, that the indoor smoking ban came into effect. And it is interesting, I feel, how critical culture and our perceptions of culture and our experience of culture is when confronted with these choices, because before the smoking ban came in, it was so regular and ordinary for people to be seen and smoke indoors and in bars, that the idea that the smoking ban could come in was quite a shock to the system. And here we are now, 13 years later, feeling as though it would be remarkable for the converse to be true, where the reintroduction of smoking in indoor spaces would be phenomenal, and not necessarily in a good way. But it is interesting that as a society, we can make these cultural shifts and accept them when we see the benefits of them as the new norm. On this next slide, I think it's important to remember how vulnerable we are as pedestrians. This cute little picture of a young boy and girl making their way probably to school, and how sensitive we are to our physical environment, and particularly when we've got to share it with the physical jeopardy of cars and sharing space with cars in urban environments. And similarly, on this next sheet, on this next page, this wider constituency that we've also got to serve and pay proper due cognizance and respect to, which are a range of people with pan disability impairments and limitations, whether that's blind people or people with autism or nerve damage or whatever it might be, and how we need to make sure our urban settlements properly address their needs as well. So on this next slide, this is a very basic sort of representation of the balance of our streets as they are. And you can see proportionally just how much space is allocated to vehicles, and people, human beings, are marginalized, squeezed into the pavements on the edges, when cyclists attempting to try and share that space in quite an intimidated way in that space as well. On the next slide, this is an attempt to just pick out the factors that have an impact on our speed and behavior. And sorry about the quality of this image on the right hand side here, but the key messages to take here is about the available lane width and the forward visibility. I mean, convention has always taught us that, or has taught us over the last 60 years, that good clear sight lines and good generous wide highway lent itself to safe environments, gave people plenty of opportunity to see what was coming. But the paradox actually is, the more generous you are with that geometry, the faster vehicles tend to travel, and that brings with it a heightened level of jeopardy and danger for those not in cars or in vehicles. And on this next sheet is a similarly simplistic attempt to try and convey that if we changed the geometry and tightened up the space and reapportioned it, we could bring the vitality and energy and interest of different uses into the space and make it much more sophisticated and much more interesting. And on these next few slides, it's just giving a feel of the sort of environmental quality that comes with those choices, making proper provision for cycling, public transport and buses in this case being absolutely key, and that's the waiting environment, the frequency and comfort of the buses and all those other factors to make it more attractive to travel by public transport. On climate resilience, creating the space and opportunities for more planting, more trees. These images from the bottom right are from Portland and Oregon in America, and they're called rain gardens, but actually they're functional drainage, and I'll come on to that in a little bit more detail in a moment. But if we reapportion the space and rebalance the streets, there then is the opportunity to include these things into our streetscapes. And on this next one is just kind of showing the street life, the vitality that then comes if we rebalance the streets and make it more attractive for people to spend time there on foot and give the life back into them. On this next little series of slides, it's just making sure that the aesthetic, the visual impact of our streets and spaces creates interest and has an impact visually on how we experience the streets, creating in this instance these interesting structures in the background and some green foliage and meaningful plants and vegetation to create that energy and interest. But then it's also the sights and sounds of these spaces. So without the intrusion of cars, I know electric cars change the sound and to a certain extent the smell of our urban centres. But I'm sure you remember, it was just mentioned there about, you know, Altrincham before the canopy was built in 2015. Shaw's Road there, or just as you come onto this back street here, was pretty awful. If you can remember, the market stalls were kind of enclosed behind a wall, and the market traders were kind of huddled under those covers. And what this arrangement has done is really opened up that space and turned it into a proper piece of townscape, made it much more interesting and much more vitality. There is on this next slide a key metric, with that being for us as human beings to have a 1,000 stimulus an hour or a stimulus every 4 seconds, which is really interesting when you think about children and trying to increase their desire to walk and the comfort and enjoyment that they might have, and the safety and comfort that they may have as they walk through and experience these places. This next dial here is a piece of work that Transport for London have commissioned, which is a healthy streets assessment. And these are the kind of key metrics that when we're designing streets and apportioning space that we should properly consider, ranging from clean air, things to see, people feel safe, not too noisy, people choose to walk and cycle, places to stop, shade and shelter, easy to cross. I mean, very basic things, but trying to reconcile those interests when the space is also occupied by large volumes of traffic is very, very challenging. On this next slide here, I just wanted to introduce the concept of what's termed as sustainable urban drainage. And I don't want to get too technical on this point, but with a natural open green field, undisturbed landscape, it's soft. And as the water lands on the surface, it slowly percolates through the surface and back into the natural geographic systems before it ends up in local brooks and streams and ultimately rivers and out to sea. The trees and plants also effectively, evapotranspiration releases some of that moisture back into the air. The systems that we have in our urban environments is actually, it accelerates the rate at which water passes across and through the streets. And that only means that it gets to the bottleneck in those networks faster. And you can see you can see on this graph on the right hand side this spike, this red line showing this spike, which is where we end up with floods. And Altrincham has been experiencing that. And these next few images are a record of some of the storms that we experienced as recently as last year. This middle one is outside Nando's pretty shocking image there of that person up to their knees almost, certainly above their ankles, in floodwater. And Regent Road spilling down into Goose Green has also been problematic. And having surfaces, streets that don't have any of these measures, sustainable urban drainage systems in them, only exacerbate that problem and increase the likelihood of it leading to flooding and property damage. There is a wider point on this next image, which is about the climate, and incredibly, since Joe Biden's election, or well, whatever you want to call the current state of the American election at the moment, but certainly Joe Biden's election offers the prospect of increased interest in climate-related issues. Glasgow hosts COP26 next year, and it is going to be interesting to see what national governments across the world say and do and commit money to in terms of trying to address some of these issues. This next image here is picking up on the point of removing barriers to cycling, because a lot of people understandably think of cyclists and think of them as lycra clad, I don't know what you might call them, sort of adrenaline junkies trying to get through some of the streets and spaces we've got. But actually this organization in London, Wheels for Wellbeing, purposely goes out into the community to try and identify people who would not ordinarily or easily engage with cycling. And I've met a number of this community, and it is really heartening to hear their stories where in London, having had access to adapted bikes, they've led more independent lives because they're not having to try and negotiate tubes or getting on and off buses in difficult areas. They can actually travel from their home to their destination independently using adapted bikes for that purpose. And I do think that there's a much broader range of people that, with encouragement and the right infrastructure, would be minded to do something similar. This next image here is just attempting to try and convey the social impact that a lot of these decisions have, and how the clustering of some investment choices leads to a hardening of or a reduced opportunity for some neighbourhoods. And actually, by investing in a more sensitive way, there's a broadening out. It's more democratic. Cycling and walking is a low entry, low cost way of getting access to transport. There's a 30% of maintaining a vehicle over the course of a year. It can represent up to 30% of some parts of our society's annual income, which is a sizable portion. And that then means that they're limited in the choices that they have, other than having to own a car to get access to work and other things. And that comes forward in terms of measuring social impact. And this next slide here is just sort of identifying some of those metrics and some of those themes. I'm not going to go through all of those, but just to give a flavor, in terms of social value, improved well-being, mental health and physical health, physical savings, reduced costs associated with welfare benefits, crime, education. If we're offering people the opportunity to travel greater distances, or rather more comfortably having to travel shorter distances to get access to work, that's much better for their pocket. This next picture here is from The Guardian in recent days. It could have been in the Telegraph as well. I saw the same article or a similar article in the Telegraph. And interestingly here, the local trust, NHS Trust, is paying £250,000 to install. LTN is an acronym for Low Traffic Neighbourhoods, which is an initiative that's coming forward across different neighbourhoods in London. And this is where they're starting to limit the true traffic in certain neighbourhoods. And in this instance, the trust undertook a kind of business case assessment and concluded that that investment would ultimately save the trust money by not having to treat people with a number of those public health issues I identified earlier, whether it's diabetes or obesity or whatever, and they've chosen to invest in this fashion. I'll come back to this in a little bit more detail in a moment. On this next slide, we regularly get challenged, we collectively, about our climate and its suitability or otherwise for cycling. And it's interesting, these images are from the Hardy Danes, the Copenhageners, and here they are cycling in all sorts of weather conditions. Cycling to them is just a utility. It's just an everyday experience. The weather doesn't detract from the numbers that choose to cycle, and they just dress for it. And I think importantly, It's about the distances that you've got to travel, and I'll come back to a slide just in the one after this, but on this next immediate slide, it just offers up the comparison in terms of temperature and average days per rainy season. You can see how similar it is. In this instance, it's compared to Glasgow, but if anything, Glasgow's weather is slightly worse than Manchester in terms of its inclement days. And it's interesting where in Copenhagen, it's just regarded as an everyday occurrence and normal. And here we feel that it's an impediment to our choices with regards to walking or cycling. This next image, thank you, Angela, is showing the bottom half of that previous diagram that I'd shown. And this is where we look at the 20-minute neighborhood principles. I should emphasize that 20-minute is recently and often also substituted for 15-minute. In some respects, it doesn't matter what that number is. It's about compact neighborhoods. And that means that actually you're traveling shorter distances to access more things. So rather than previously where you'd only have one purpose in one area, whether that's business or retail or residential, here we're talking about having more composite towns, more composite neighborhoods where you can travel shorter distances to access a broader range of amenity and services within your local neighborhood. And that's the principle of a compact neighborhood. Some of the infrastructure that might support that is captured on this next series of slides. This you might recognize as Great Ancoat Street in Manchester, and the city centre is just to the right of this image, this street, and you could, if you were to squint, you could probably make out Piccadilly Station just on the right hand side of the diagram. That's how close to the city centre we are. And on the left, you've got the emerging neighbourhoods of New Islington and Ancoats, which have been resurgent in the last 10, 15 years. But actually, Great Ancoat Street is a real barrier to the free movement of those people into the city centre and making that a very difficult choice for them. And this next image shows, if you were to apply these principles, how some of those spaces could be transformed and the space on the street reallocated to other more human appropriated needs, green infrastructure, offering amenity and biodiversity, but also cycling and walking and street activity, making it a much more desirable space to be. I'm slightly conscious of time here. I hope I'm not taking up too much of your evening. I will try and get through the next. Okay.
Yeah.
I was just going to share with you some of the work that we're doing in Glasgow. On this next slide shows a map of Glasgow. For anybody that's been to Glasgow, you might recognize that grey band that wraps around to the left and over the top of this diagram as the M8, the motorway. The blue band across the bottom is the River Clyde. And the streets that we're talking about are the 16 major streets in the centre of the city. So they're not too dissimilar to maybe 16 Deansgates, if you're looking at it in Manchester terms. And this project, The Avenues, is looking at fundamentally restructuring these 16 core streets across the centre of the city to make them much more attractive for the principles that are shown on this next page. The objectives of the project are about improving connectivity, improving the city image, making the city more attractive for inward investment, supporting redevelopment. So in making the streets more resilient, it reduces the pressure on the infrastructure, which makes some sites and plots that were commercially unviable for investment, making them more attractive for investment and bringing them forward, and then enhancing and protecting the environment. You know, as already mentioned, flooding and heat are two key environmental issues that we've got to deal with. So they do make them more environmentally resilient, but it's also then reducing the impact of emissions, air quality, as well as the noise intrusion of vehicles. As you might expect in undertaking a project of this type, and we've been involved in this project for about 3 years, we've been engaging with a very, very broad number of interests. So a project of that scale, everybody's affected in some fashion. So I personally have had the privilege of meeting thousands of Glaswegians over the last 3 years and talking to them about the concerns and issues that they've had and how the streets need to adapt to their needs. Some of that group are represented on this next image. These people are from the Glasgow Disability Alliance. And we've been having tours with them around the town. This is taking Glasgow City Council officers to different places. This is actually a study trip to Manchester to look at some of the cycling infrastructure on Oxford Road in Manchester. And this next image is showing one of the routes. And this is a Victorian street map before the motorway was planted in on top. And you can see all of those little fine-veined connections of streets that connect those neighbourhoods off to the west into the city centre, into the core. If you keep an eye on that yellow line, that represents the route I'm about to refer to. And if you look at the next image, you can see in the 1960s, after Mr. Ernest Marples had instigated the building of motorways, you have the M8 that's planted down on top of the city and severs all those connections and disrupts all of that movement. And you end up with spaces like the ones on the next page, on this next sheet. Pretty inhospitable places, noisy, unattractive, quite dangerous really for people not in a car, and even in a car it's a bit dangerous. And the project is looking on this next image to give you a flavour of how transformative it's going to punch or reinstate the connection that passed right under that space and make those neighbourhoods much shorter distances from the city centre to be able to walk and cycle to. This next image is again just the one below is showing the setting of this existing very distinctive, beautiful Gushit building, as it's referred to locally, with the Glasgow School of Art wrapped around the back. And on the next image, you can see the changes that are proposed, really opening up the space and creating a much more coherent landscape, much more direct connections for those neighbourhoods across and around that beautiful building. One more example of a street change. This is Argyle Street. That's Glasgow Central Station there in the background that straddles the road. 4 lanes of traffic in this very urban setting. And on the next page then, this is the scale of change that we're looking at. The green bands of reeds on the left and right flank here are rain gardens, as I've referred to before, to help hold and slow down water as it enters the system. There's a very shallow railway tunnel that sits immediately below this highway, so it was very difficult to get any trees into this street. But you can see it is a fundamental reordering of the space. This next diagram is showing the types of techniques that we're looking to employ to get some of the green infrastructure. This crushed rock arrangement has gaps in it that can hold and store water and release it slowly back into the underlying soil. So all of that preamble kind of brings us back to our neighbourhood. And this next image here, just looking at a mosaic of neighbourhoods across Trafford, the bone structure of streets that enables 20-minute neighbourhoods across Trafford. And we've been working with Trafford, looking at a Trafford design guide and thinking about what the infrastructure across the borough could look like to start to bring forward some of these ideas. It is interesting, if you take the 7 core towns across Trafford, Altrincham, Sale, Stretford and so on, if you took a 20-minute isochrone, which is one of these shapes, and used the centre of Sale as the centre of gravity, they interlap or overlap. So it does lend itself very readily to this type of approach. This next slide is a sort of reiteration, really, of the ingredients that make up a 20-minute neighbourhood. So from your front door, from where you live, you've got straightforward access by bike or walking or public transport to each of these really important amenities and facilities and services within your neighbourhood. Just to pick out one or two, safe streets and spaces, but also green streets and spaces, well connected to public transport and jobs and services within the region, local shopping facilities, good local health and schools. So it's all of those key things, which we're really lucky to have, frankly, in Altrincham, all on our doorstep. So it's just shifting the infrastructure around to make it a bit more attractive to walk and cycle to those different places. Not to the exclusion of cars, but just to downplay the dominance of cars in those spaces. That's achieved using a hierarchy of streets, which is shown on this next image. So if there was 2 key qualities of any given street, you've got the place quality on the left-hand axis here, and the movement quality on the bottom axis, and they're color coded to correspond to different types of streets, which are identified in this column on the right hand side. And then applying that logic to Altrincham. So if you on this next image here, if you then took a 20-minute isochrone, which is basically just the distance that you could travel in a 20-minute cycle from the centre of Altrincham, you could get beyond the M56 if you travelled off to the south and make quite a long distance over towards Sale, off towards the north. But then there's different types of streets that then sit within that plan, and bringing them together as a coherent network of spaces. And then there's some examples then given on this next series of slides as to what they may look like, and the apportionment of use, dominance of use within that space. So this being a local street or a school zone. On the next one then, please, Angela. A town square. And then the next one being a town centre street. The designs for Stamford New Road, sorry, Angela, just if you go back for one moment, thank you. The designs for Stamford New Road were inspired by a Dutch approach, which is called a Fietstraat. And you can see this image here on the right-hand side is actually from a Dutch street. And it's where the regulated number of cars and buses and vehicles, so on, are such that cyclists feel quite comfortable in that space. And on this next image, these are the types of signs that you see in these streets in Holland, in Rotterdam, or Groningen, or wherever it may be. And I'm sure you'll recognize some of the DNA of that concept in Stamford New Road. This next image, again, nobody on this call needs too much of a reminder as to what Stamford New Road looked like before. This is probably taken about 2014, maybe, this image. And this image as it is as of today, or, not necessarily this day in November, but, a nice day in the middle of summer when the trees are in leaf, and we're not subject to COVID. So I think that's the last slide, is it, Angela?
It is, yeah.
So I appreciate there's a lot of information in there. I hope I took it at the right pace. I'm clearly more than happy to field any questions if you've got any for me.
Yeah,
Can I just ask? No.
I've got one, Stephen.
Yeah.
I mean, Goose Green flooding, I was involved with quite closely in June, because all businesses were closed. I realised there was going to be a problem, and I shot straight into town at 10 o'clock at night and got businesses out to sort out the problems. But actually, the problems came from where I live, which is on the A56. So it's not just about the town centre, it's about doing things further out, if you like, because the water flows from where I live. If the grids and what have you are blocked, it flows straight into the town centre. So although what you're talking about is the town centre, it's how do we manage things further out, if you like.
I couldn't agree more. I think the point at which the flooding manifests itself is too late. You don't solve river flooding by dealing with where it pops up at the river in the middle of the town. You've got to replant the trees on the uplands where you've got to consider it as a catchment, as a full basin, and deal with it that way. So I couldn't agree more with you, Angela. Indeed, that Trafford are these ideas, and the idea of SUDS is still relatively innovative, believe it or not. But I do think that there is increasing momentum in authorities embracing this, and the economics and the commercial impact of it is not straightforward, because you've got organisations like United Utilities,
yeah,
who are a private enterprise, who are responsible for the network. How do you incentivise organisations like that to invest in a different way in those networks? So they are bureaucratically and commercially very challenging problems to unravel.
Richard Rowe tells us that we're ready to embark on phase 3 and 4 of the public realm after Christmas.
Yes.
So will we be looking to improve what happened on phase 1 and phase 2? I mean, phase 1 certainly encounters flooding, doesn't it, Angela?
It does, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's as an engineer, at the end of the day, we're consultants, and while we can advise and instruct, or not rather instruct, but we can offer up considered argument. It's the prerogative of the client to make final decisions as to what they want to invest their money in. And at any given time, we all know how precious money is when it comes to investing in public realm and into streets. And authorities, they're damned if they do and they're damned if they don't. It's one thing if Trafford were to turn around and invest large sums of money in putting in such systems right across Trafford, and people would say, well, what about the primary healthcare trust, or what about, why aren't my bins being collected more frequently, or how come Amy don't change the light bulbs in those lights more often? It's a very, very delicate balance to strike. So I think the councils do act in good faith, but they act under the prevailing pressures that they experience at any given point in time. And
for example, with Regent Road, because that's going to be done as part of the Regent Road car park development, should we be looking more to do more green, maybe grass, the pampas grass type idea on Regent Road to try and absorb some of the water from further up, while we try and sort out what's going on sort of Booth Road, Groby Road areas?
Well, I think COVID has presented Trafford with the opportunity to explore and to test some ideas. And I think it's going to be interesting to see how that comes forward over the course of the next couple of months. I mean, we've seen really mixed responses to the pop-up cycling infrastructure, the A56 and other places. And personally, I'm an advocate of experimenting and testing things, but it's really difficult to do 60 years worth of decision making and trying to undo it in 6 months. I think that's almost, you're almost destined to fail. And I think that's why the 20-minute neighborhood principle is quite interesting, because people's patterns of how they live their lives at the moment has got the car at the middle of it. And if all of a sudden you do is chop up the infrastructure and say, no, you've got to walk and cycle, they go, well, how am I meant to do that? My child goes here, or I pick up an elderly aunt from here, or whatever it might be. You can't make that adjustment overnight. It needs to be more transitionary. But I do think testing things, pilot schemes, other things, can provide you with some empirical data to inform those types of decisions.
Helena, you wanted to ask a question.
Yeah, I was sort of, when you were talking about streets having more space for bikes and everything else, I sort of was thinking about Chester and the Rose. I mean, maybe sometime in the future, if pedestrians were on the first floor and retail shop windows were on the first floor, and that ground level with the bikes and the vehicles, which are always going to have delivery vehicles and so forth, for a sort of future, I don't know whether that might be feasible in some areas or not.
Well, I think what's emerging, because the other major thing on the horizon here is the future of retail, isn't it?
Yes.
Retail is, whatever changes were in play before COVID has acted as a catalyst for that change. It's seriously disrupted now. Whether that's ever going to recover, I'm not sure. But I think it's unlikely. However, what that I think now means is that there's an opportunity to think about the experiential quality of our towns and cities. If anything, heritage and the storytelling of historical towns provides a richer experience for when you enter into a town and you want to travel there for more social interactions and to be surrounded by an environment that tells a story in and of itself. So the heritage qualities of our historic towns, and the market charter of Altrincham and the different layers and patina that Altrincham offers, it's taken centuries to create, provides that richness and that backdrop. So, sorry, that was a rather long-winded answer to what I think is a key point, which is we should try and limit vehicles coming into the town centre and encourage people to come in and spend time out of vehicles in cars. And we've already got Amazon as a sort of consolidated freight depot anyway, and it'd be interesting to see how that reduces the number of deliveries that are ultimately needed in future town centres, because there's a fleet of vans, much smaller vehicles, now roving around our streets during the day, dropping off the stuff that we've ordered online.
Martin, did you
With
want
more
to?
and more people, though, living in somewhere like Manchester, there are going to be, more and more people ordering online, aren't there, and living in flats and all the rest of it. So it's finding that balance, isn't it? But I just thought, thinking about the roads in Chester and climate's getting, if you like, more predictable, more rain and all the rest of it, that...
I think we'd like to share your slides, Stephen. We're doing a lot of work on the GMSF, particularly with Carrington.
Sure.
We're doing transport workshops and clean air workshops. So I think if you're willing, that we could do that and then feed back.